Hello, everybody, and welcome to the storytelling workshop created by Sac Blue and hosted by David Blue Garrison and moderated by myself, Rae Smith. In today's workshop, we're going to go over the fundamentals of storytelling and discussing some of the fears that often prevent us from accessing the most creative parts of ourselves. The workshop's broken into 9 parts. Immediately following each part, there will be a brief Q&A pertaining to that content. At this time, we're going to make sure that you guys are all muted and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. And we're going to remove that. If you're having any trouble at any point, just go ahead and let me know. I can help you out with that. If you have any questions at any time, feel free to type them into the chat. I will gather and present them to David at the end of that pertaining part or section where he will briefly address them. You will be able to request PDFs of the general topics that our workshop's going to cover today, but the full transcript won't be made available, so just make sure you take some notes. Some things that you should know about David before listening to him talk for the next hour and a half, having even a semblance of trust in what he has to say, it's that he's been in an irresponsible creative state of behavior for nearly 31 years, from creating parent-acclaimed theatrical productions in his backyard from ages 6 to 16, to writing a plethora of short stories on his brother word processor gifted to him by his grandfather. For the record, it was a dance machine when it was gifted to him. He isn't quite that old. He was consistently the popular choice as the classroom playwright for historic reenactments all through middle school and high school. And while he's been in theater for as long as he can remember, David directed his first production when he was 17, and he's gone on to direct nearly 40 others. David ran a successful production company for 7 years before handing it off to other talented folks. He's written 8 entries into the Midsummer Nightmare Farcical stage productions and 3 full-length plays. One which has been stage read to an audience with an apparent limitless stamina for sitting. David maintains a student mindset in all things that he does and would never consider himself the authority on any topic, but always eager to collaborate and share ideas with the folks around him. And finally, and probably the most important part, is the goal of this workshop is never to tease, embarrass, or shame any of you. There are things that David will talk about with passion and oftentimes equal frustration and exasperation, but know that that's not directed towards any of you personally. Instead, they're likely geared towards himself. David, did you have anything else to say here before we get started?
Yes, I'm excited that we're still doing the workshop. As many of you know and had registered, it was an in-person workshop. But of course, with everything going on in the world, we are all at home. So I'm happy that we can still do it. It will be obviously massively shorter than what was advertised before. And a lot of it is just scripted because I can't really have a lot of the back and forth. Hopefully you will engage after each part. So if you do have questions, just as Amanda said, type those into the chat and they'll be addressed when the part is over. But the best way to view this workshop this afternoon or evening, whenever it is view it as an audiobook where you can pause the speaker and ask him a few questions before he proceeds. I think that's it.
Cool. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
All right, so hopefully you are all have notebooks and pens, like Amanda stated, to be writing things down, and we'll jump right in. So part 1, storytelling and your creativity. There is a rhythm and order to how we recount stories to our friends, first establishing the people and the atmosphere to lend the proper tone to the story you are assembling in your listener's mind. You introduce all the necessary information before striking with the punchline that brings the story together. When you cook your holiday meal for family and friends, you begin with the appetizers. They're bite-sized snacks that hint at the magnum opus that has yet to be served. The main entree is delicious, and it means more because of the small, tasty stories you led with. The way in which we write music, frame a photo, compose an illustration, and choose which colors to use, these are all forms of storytelling. Storytelling isn't just about talking at someone or creating some impenetrable piece that remains static for your audience. Storytelling isn't just for books, scripts, or poetry. Storytelling is a conversation. It's a shared experience between you, your creation, and its audience. Every person on this planet has creative strengths. They manifest in different mediums and levels for everyone, but in each of us is a unique concoction of creative energy. Knowing what to do with that energy can be a lifelong project, and if you relax a little bit, it's a very enjoyable lifelong project. Storytelling can often seem like an overwhelming task or one that puts you into a vulnerable position you are not comfortable being in. The first thing to understand is that some of the fear can be healthy. Some of those uncomfortable feelings as you attempt to create something could be a sign of working in a great direction. And wanting to create things for some validation and some attention is also perfectly fine. But it is about striking the balance in all of those things that will help you create more honest work and sustain yourself for longer. One of the things that we will be talking about today is reckless writing. And while you have no idea what that means right now, we're going to try it. So on the piece of paper or notes section of your phone or whatever it is that you're using to take notes, I want you to write the following words. I am a creative person because. So now that you've done that, when I say go, you're going to write as many things that come to your mind after that sentence. And I do not want you to overthink anything that you write. You do not need to worry if any of it's even true. Don't edit yourself. Just get everything down that comes to you. You have 1 minute, all right? So I am a creative person because. Go.
It's been about 15 seconds so far. "30 seconds left. "10 seconds.
So intense.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's time.
All right. So hopefully you all got a good number of things written down and that you did not second guess anything that you wrote or crossed anything out. As we progress through the workshop, you will find that throwing everything you have against a wall when starting out on a project is a healthy and often revealing thing to do. So right now, I want to know if anyone was surprised by anything that they wrote down. Does anyone want to share what they wrote down? If you do, go ahead and put it into the chat right now. Oftentimes, there are not only thoughts and feelings that are on the brink of our minds ready to pour out. Sometimes ideas or little bits of magic reside there too. But when you focus too hard or try to control too much of your own process, those ideas actually vanish. Much like storytelling, you can't force anything too hard or it will become hollow and easily detected as dishonest by your audience. So being flexible and allowing words, ideas, and emotions to flow easily is a skill that you will get better at with time. So that's the end of part 1, storytelling and creativity. So I want to know if anyone has any questions or if anyone shared something they wrote down.
Jared put in the chat, final line, release valve on that ever-expanding lead balloon.
That's beautiful. I'm gonna steal that and I'm going to make that the title of my memoir. Stories to tell. Nice.
Not seeing any questions right now.
All right. I'm going to move on. So part 2, fear until overwhelmed. What is preventing you from creating? What is stopping you from getting that novel finished, the cookbook started, or your web series filmed? How many projects lay half started and abandoned? How many times have you shared your idea with friends and family but haven't brought yourself to actually create it? You may be afraid of being disappointed or stressed with how it feels to create and feeling overwhelmed by the very concept of starting your project. There's feelings of jealousy or comparison to other creators. There's feeling like a fraud or an outsider, or the fear that if we do create this thing, it won't be as good as what we imagined in our minds. For each of us, we carry a myriad of hangups when it comes to being creative. Some people can't even bring themselves to calling themselves creative. That could come from how you were raised or past experiences you label as failures. For the sake of time and focusing too much on the not so fun stuff, we will focus on 3 things that can contribute to not being creative due to self-doubt. These 3 things I've put into a single sentence: fear until overwhelmed. Fear comes in many forms, but the most common way in which it presents itself is anger and frustration. I had listed some fears already of not being good enough, or other people have done it before you, that you're not really a creative person, but just playing one, that if someone did tell you that you are talented or creative, they didn't really mean it. I'm not going to go on forever, but we all have a huge laundry list of fears. And I don't want to spoil the ending too much for any of you, but I will tell you that it is never going to be about getting rid of these fears, suddenly banishing them away. That's never an option. Instead, we have to learn to live with them. You have to accept your fears, but let them know that you acknowledge their existence, but inform them that they won't be controlling any more major decisions in your life. They'll understand it's not them, it's you. It's you wanting to be better. And fear also comes with something I call the until syndrome, or the constant putting off of feeling how you want to feel when you are creating. We all too often get into a habit of saying, I will be a real artist when, and then you can fill in your own blank there. Or I won't be content with my work until I am published, or finish a 1,000+ page novel, or get a gallery show, or have more than 1,000 followers on Instagram, and blah, 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 blah. That list can go on forever. We can do the same thing with our happiness. We say we'll be able to relax once we go on this particular vacation, or be happy when we get that promotion, or when that super cool looking video game comes out. The until syndrome will keep you in a constant state of dissatisfaction and longing for an ideal state of being you likely already have access to. Until syndrome is also really good at helping you procrastinate and make excuses for why you aren't being creative. Things like, I don't have time to be creative. I don't have enough money to be creative. I don't have the space to be creative. I don't have the right tools to be creative. No one is going to be better than you at convincing yourself that you can't be creative. You've got a huge list of untils that at some crazy point, they outnumber how many projects you actually want to do. And then you will be truly stuck. You have to kick those untils to the wayside. And finally, overwhelmed. One of the biggest things that prevents us from starting our project, whether it be a book, a song, a live performance, is knowing where to start and being overwhelmed by the size and complicated steps of that idea. I get people all the time who want to talk to me about their 3-part book series with plot points and special reveals that are spaced out, and how it's going to be so popular among young adults and kickstart this revolution of literature. And they will make a Netflix series, and then it will be made into a better movie, and then adapted into a graphic novel, and this just goes on and on forever. Yet they haven't written a single word of this story. And for the record, there's nothing wrong with being as ambitious as that person's fantasy is. The kind of unstable confidence is going to help you in the world of creativity. But back to this person that has laid out this massive concept and hasn't started any of it. Frankly, I don't blame anyone for being terrified to write the first word of what will ultimately become thousands of words, potentially stretched across 3 books. That would overwhelm anyone. If you had to climb a 1,000-foot mountainside and all you did was stare at the top, it would be nearly impossible to climb at all, when instead you should be focused on the small rock grips directly in front of you. This constant oral telling of your grandmaster creative project is when people get stuck into one of the most gratifying and dangerous of places to be as a creative person, something that I call the creative fantasy monologue. It's when you get immense joy and validation from recounting your epic idea to someone with all the bells and whistles of a good idea. They gasp at the twist of your book, they look impressed by the size of your project, they appear to be hanging on every word, and you get to enjoy this perfect version of your idea because you haven't started it yet. And it gets to remain flawless because it's sitting there without detail in your brain. You don't have to mourn cut characters or scenes or lines or repaint over mistakes. You don't have to feel the frustration of things not working or having a block because it only exists in your head. It's still perfect. And then your friend, whom you're sharing your creative fantasy monologue with, asks when it will be done. And all of your happiness is sucked out of you. Suddenly you're defensive and put out. Fear and until syndrome has now taken hold. So before I get into the strategies for dealing with fear until overwhelmed, what I want you to do is I want you to write down which parts of fear until overwhelmed you think you experience the most. Is it fear and overwhelmed? Is it just fear? Maybe you only suffer from the until syndrome, but write down which ones affect you. And if anyone wants to, you can share those in the chat right now. So while you're considering sharing these very vulnerable things into the chat, I'm going to ask Amanda how she's doing. Amanda, how are you doing?
Actually, I'm doing very well. Been enjoying my day, and then of course I get to hang out with you, which is cool, I guess.
Perfect.
My cat also came and joined me in my lap, so.
Oh, perfect. Hopefully we all have cats on our laps right now.
Oh, yeah. It looks like Serena Holland said fear and overwhelmed for me, and Melissa Manchester said fear of just not knowing how and where to start.
Awesome. Not awesome. You know what I mean. Awesome. Awesome that you're sharing. And hopefully you're all writing these things, and these can stay personal to you.
We got Allison that says mainly overwhelmed.
Totally.
Oh, Nolan said each of the three, depending on the day or the project, it can vary.
Yep, that's normal.
Jared said same. Irma said until and overwhelmed. Ronnie did share. She said she loses focus, so she can become overwhelmed because of that. So yeah, it looks like everybody kind of experiences different things on different levels.
And I love what Nolan said, where it changes, and you're going to experience any of those three also on different kinds of projects. It's depending on how you're being challenged. So let's move on. I'm going to somewhat tell you how to deal with these things, but that feels like overpromising. But let's jump in. Okay, so what do we do with first fear? We need to go back to the beginning and ask ourselves, why are we creative? What is it about our personality that makes us a creative person, and in what ways are we creative? Are we really good at illustrating emotion and expression? Do we have a knack for coming up with simple sentences that convey complex experiences? Are we able to portray emotions and experiences through acting, dancing, or singing? And where do we think this creative energy comes from? Was it discovered when you were younger, or was it more recent? You should write all of these things down. And you should also keep these questions constantly running through your mind. And your answers to those questions, they may evolve over time. You may come across epiphanies that alter your creative outlook. But I believe that it is this constant grounding of you and your creative energy and its origins and history that can help you with fear. So when we know why we are creating, it can make the fear of comparing our work to others less detrimental. When the inspiration of our creativity is a known thought and feeling, we feel more comfortable in that realm. It's less likely that we will feel like an outsider. When we create more for ourselves and for the real joy of creating in the moment, the validation that comes later seems a lot less important. When the goal is artistic integrity and not views, likes, or attention, validation or some kind of proof that we are an artist, that the work that we create will become more honest and less hollow when we let those things go. Our creations become an extension of ourselves. So what you need to do is you need to ask yourself, and maybe you need to ask this of yourself each time before you set out to create, is do you have the bravery to allow yourself to create for just you? Or, as Jack Gilbert, the best poet on the entire planet, said, do you have the courage to bring forth this work? The treasures that are hidden inside you are hoping you will say yes. Until syndrome. Living constantly in a state of never being satisfied, being too obsessed with the eventual timing of completion on a project, being published, receiving accolades and attention, convincing yourself it just isn't the right time to be creative. It's not the right place or situation. I will sit down and write that book after I finish this laundry. Or the kitchen counters really need to be cleaned, and I should probably empty the litter box, and I should really call my grandma and say hi. These are all excuses we make when we sit down to create something. However, if it does strike you to call your grandma, I think that you probably should stop and just do it. So while it's perfectly okay and sometimes motivating to use validation and attention as a means of encouragement, those two things are neither consistent or reliable. And waiting to start your project until you have more time is one of the most convenient and convincing ways to prevent you from being creative. It's another form of waiting until something you don't actually need to be creative. I don't think that you need a lot of time, a lot of free time, and I don't think that you need a lot of validation. And you don't need to be published to consider yourself an artist. You don't need to upgrade any of your equipment or take a certain workshop, except for this one, or read a particular book to be creative. Some of those things, they may be along your path of creativity, but a lack of them is not a steel door against your progress as a creative. It's you. Do not wait until. Now is the time to be creative. You need to be present. You need to remind yourself of your creative history, what makes you special, and if you create with those things in mind, you will discover a happiness and peace with the simple act of creating. And that is when you will strike upon the magic, when all of those exterior fears and those until feelings subside. Just creating will then be enough to nourish you. And finally, what do we do when we are overwhelmed by our own projects? You remember that 3-part book series? That's an enormous undertaking, working on a story of that size, and not to mention the work that comes along with looking for an agent and then getting signed and then from there trying to get published. All of that will just spin your mind if you think about all of it at once. When you're starting a project, and sometimes in the middle of a project, that overwhelming feeling of never being able to finish it can also be crushing. But in those scenarios, it is best to compartmentalize your thoughts and your assignment. After all, writing a sweeping epic novel is not one task, but really hundreds and maybe thousands of smaller ones. So as Anne Lamott would say, it is best to view your next step through a square-inch frame. If you're penning a screenplay about a cyberpunk dystopian future that includes a politically charged story about cyborgs and artificial intelligence, and you're feeling stressed by the magnitude of that story, why don't you write about the main character's shoes, or their apartment, or an average morning with them, or their 6th birthday, or their left pinky finger? Or how about the kind of weather that this dystopian city is experiencing? Or describe your villain. And maybe not what the villain is doing or the epicness of their evil plan, but instead write about the way they laugh when they're nervous, or the style of their clothing and what inspired them. Write about the garbage men in the dystopian city. Write about the street vendors and the gangs of children who steal from them, but keep all of these topics small and focused to individual details and aspects. We can't get to the big political thriller plotline if we don't know these characters and the world we're in. And you have to start somewhere small, something simple, your square-inch picture frame. Allowing yourself to just focus on one thing makes the entirety of your project a lot less intimidating. Allow yourself to enjoy the accomplishment of this one small assignment. So when you're sitting there thinking about where to start and feeling overwhelmed, tell yourself, okay, for the next 45 minutes, all you have to do is write about what you can see through the square-inch frame. So that's the end of part 2. Do we have any questions? I wish they would show if someone's typing or not.
That would make it a little easier. So we do have a question that says, so completely avoid untils.
It's definitely about balance. So if the untils are preventing you from work, then you're leaning too much into that. You're letting it control you too much. So trying to stay present and trying to avoid the things that are stopping you from working. Some of them are valid, right? You're trying to work on something and your house is on fire. You should probably wait till your house is not on fire, and then you're allowed to start writing. But it is about striking that balance. How often are your untils preventing you from getting started or from finishing? If it feels like it's too much, they have to be assessed and then they have to be eliminated. It's a lot easier said than done. Totally aware of that. but finding that balance and recognizing that balance and challenging yourself to say that how important are these untills? Okay, cool. We're gonna move on to part 3. So write reckless every day. Now, when I say write recklessly, I don't mean that you should gather up all your writing utensils and loose pieces of paper and go drifting in a sports car while writing your screenplay. What I do mean, though, is that you should write. You should do it every day, preferably at the same time and for the same duration, and that you should do it without any regard for quality or quantity. If you're anything like me, you may be terrified of ruining a brand new journal with unworthy writing. The number of journals that I have left untouched because I didn't want to sully them with anything less than perfect. And I truly mourn those days of cautious writing, because in that time of meticulously writing with great slowness and unnecessary fact-checking, I was learning nothing about my creativity, and I wasn't growing. We cannot be afraid to write crap at first. Our first draft will very likely be garbage, and that is totally okay. For one thing, only you will see that first draft. And 2, you've now discovered many things that your story will not be. Give yourself permission to fill those beautiful journals with unfiltered and unedited writing. Don't distract yourself with perfect handwriting or exact details. Often people will stop writing mid-sentence because they want to look up something, like a street name, to make sure it's correct, but don't do this. Use a placeholder for now and then change it later, but do not interrupt your writing flow. There is writing time and then there is research time. And we will get to note cards and story journals and research a little bit later. But you need to use the uninterrupted flow that is your voice. And by overthinking on your first draft or allowing too many distractions will make it impossible for that voice to appear. How you choose to write every day is up to you, but I would recommend getting up an hour before everyone else does. Leave your phone by your bed, go sit somewhere, make tea or coffee, and then write for 45 minutes or however much time you have, and keep everything that you write. Attempt not to edit yourself as you go. Do not role play as other artists or writers that you enjoy. Don't apply any effect or style, just be you. It's sort of like if you've ever done improvisation, you're encouraged to just speak without thinking too hard, allowing yourself to be just as surprised by what is coming out of your mouth as by the other actors around you. This is when you are really connected to that internal voice, that voice which is truly you. At first, it may be rough around the edges or even bad, but it won't be forever. We are told so much in our lives to think before we speak, to phrase things certain ways, to have manners when it comes to dialogue. But when you are creating, you have to let all of that go. The fear that people may be offended by what you're writing, or that your parents will be embarrassed, or that you're touching sensitive topics, or that you're speaking on things you don't know anything about, that you're just making things up. This is reckless writing, and it is how we grow and learn about ourselves. So remember, none of your writing ever has to be seen by anyone until you are ready. And most people will never see your journals or your first drafts. So stop performing for an invisible audience when you sit down to write or create, and be reckless. Okay, that's the end of part 3. Writing recklessly every day. Any questions?
Allison mentioned that she says, "This is awesome. Just wanted to say thanks." Definitely agree with her. I do think this, and I know personally for myself, I have a hard time with this particular piece, is writing recklessly. I personally do a lot of holding back from writing simply because of some weird internal judgment that I give myself. So kind of cool to think about just writing, just to see what comes out, just to see what happens.
Yeah, no, I think some people are afraid to sit down and just pour into something. And I think often when we sit down to write, we think it needs to be beautiful right from the get-go, or it's not ever going to be good. Let that go. And don't be afraid. You're not going to die and people are going to find your journals and read everything and be embarrassed. And if they do, I mean, what difference does that make to you? So, okay, so moving, sorry.
Jared did throw a question in there. It says, "Is there a technique for placeholders that work well? I've never honed the skill and tend to lose them in drafts."
A technique for placeholders that work well. I'm not sure I entirely understand what that means.
You mentioned marking something like a street name instead of going to research it. So how do you mark that spot to know I need to come back and double check that?
That's a great question. If you, insert street name here in brackets. Yeah, that's not even a bad idea. Some people write, they handwrite everything. And so for that, you can use a plethora of sticky notes, which I always keep with me. And we will get to note cards, sticky notes, and things that writers should have. But yeah, there's great things in Microsoft Word or in free software like OpenOffice that has a way of tagging sections of where you're at. So if you need to tag something so you can go back to it and address it, then yeah, that's built into a lot of the software. At the same time, if you are working on your writing, you will be revisiting stuff anyway and rereading things to death. So you will discover something that maybe hasn't been fleshed out yet. And if you don't, your editor certainly will. So someone's going to catch it for sure.
Looks like Allison mentioned that it's a little scary to think about writing tons of little vignettes and then not being able to figure out how to kind of put it all together and reorganize all of that. Do you have like suggestions for that?
Yeah, you don't have to organize all of this. I think that's a big part of the recklessness that I definitely want to encourage everyone to do is sometimes we just need to write. Sometimes there is no end game for that writing. It just is for the sake of writing. If it comes to if you're writing specifically for a project though, and you want to organize those thoughts, I kind of go back to that technology that's maybe built into the software, being able to flag things, label things, put markers on stuff, and then if you're writing, longhand, using Post-its and I keep encouraging you to use a journal. You can, when I say that, I also mean a digital one too. But if you are using a physical book, like those pretty ones that we're afraid to, sully with bad writing, use Post-its and leave breadcrumbs for yourself, I guess. And then other platforms besides Word. Yeah, if you need, Word is a paid software. So if you're looking for something that's free, I do highly recommend Google Docs. It's essentially all the bells and whistles of Microsoft Word. And OpenOffice is exactly the same thing. OpenOffice is pretty much everything Word is, but completely free. And it's for both Windows and for Mac. If you are specifically looking for screenplay software or working on plays, I cannot recommend Final Draft enough. I use it for everything. It is a paid software, but honestly, it is so worth it when it comes to working on a script and when you're working with dialogue. And there's so many things built in as far as organizing scenes and characters and settings. All right. Okay, so without further ado, part 4. So getting started. So this is a larger section. Nearly every story I've told has begun with a journal. Near the completion of writing a play or a short story, that journal is often covered page to page in scribbles, drawings, maps, etc., filled with cutouts, photographs, and dried flowers at one point. This should be the Bible of your story. This is where you write good lines you've come up with that you want to utilize in your storytelling, where you wake up from a dream and scribble down all the disjointed thoughts before they disappear. This book is never edited, never curated. It is your place where not a single one of your darling ideas and words has to be cut, and no one should ever see it. This is your reckless writing journal, and this can be a place for general ideas and inspirations not yet designated for a specific story, or it can be for a specific project you're working on, and we will talk a little bit more about that later. Sometimes the idea to tell a story comes from something you see or words spoken to you, a daydream, an actual dream, a memory that comes flooding back to you because of a smell or something you hear. But wherever this little spark or bit of magic comes from, you need to examine it and to a degree determine why it means something to you. And try not to be too scientific about it, because whatever it is creating an emotional reaction for you. So you need to remain emotional when you're analyzing it. Does this idea make you feel happy or sad or apprehensive or melancholy? You have to write all of those words down in regard to this idea and this inspiration, because these are the words that we are going to come back to when we hit those roadblocks or when we lose our way working on this story. And then you have to write. That is truly the key to starting, is just to do it. To keep in mind, even if this project is a recipe or a song or a painting or designing a logo or an ad, it all still is storytelling. So you have to get it down on the page first. It's a way of organizing your thoughts. But maybe you don't have inspiration. Maybe you don't have some idea that is begging you to write about it, but you do want to write and you want to create. You want to tell a story, but you're not really sure that you have one to tell. Start exploring something that you know better than anyone else, yourself. Go back to the earliest possible memory that you have and write about it in as much detail as you can. And remember to go with the flow. You may start making things up that you're not even sure are true, but maybe as the more you write about it, elements of the memory will start to surface or your imagination will take hold. But in any of those cases, you need to follow it. And you can add little illustrations to your exploration of this memory. Attempt to define this memory in its entirety. There's no roadblock when it comes to yourself. So creating for you should come a little bit naturally. But if you are struggling, remember to use the square inch window. So many incredible pieces of art, so many of us enjoy, have come from the memories of the artist who created it. So once you've fully examined the square inch window of that memory, move on to the next earliest memory. You have a treasure chest of experiences and memories and feelings and more. There's so much content bubbling inside of you. You could write 1 million books or songs or create hundreds of paintings using yourself and your life as the inspiration. And do this for as long as you can. Make this part of your daily writing. And who knows, a brilliant idea for a story may come out of this practice. But how do you get started when you wish to tell a story on stuff you know nothing about? Perhaps you have a great idea for a painting about a greenhouse, but you don't know anything about plants or which one should actually be in one. Or you want to write a story about sailing or a song about growing up on a ranch. You feel inspired by these topics, these worlds and their texture, but it's not one that you actually know firsthand. Does this mean that you can't use it for a story? Absolutely not. You are a storyteller. You're not an expert in all things that the world has to offer. And as you're going to hear a little bit later, it's not really about what you're writing about. It's more about how you are writing and how your story is told. So if you want to do a painting about a greenhouse, go visit some greenhouses. Call the local colleges or nurseries and arrange a meeting with some experts to explore them. Take photos, take notes, ask questions. People love to talk about things that they are experts in. You may as well absorb yourself with as much of that content as you can. All of this can go into your journal or your story Bible. Same thing goes with sailing. You can call those experts, watch YouTube videos, go down the rabbit hole of the thing that you're investigating, and little gems of details may emerge, which will make your story that much more textured and lush. Okay, so that's the end of part 4, getting started. Are there any questions? Of course not, because I wrote that section perfectly. So how could there possibly be questions? Okay, perfect. So we're going to move on to, and just so everyone knows, in case you didn't know, if you have a question while I'm talking, you can put it into the chat then as well. You don't have to wait till I'm done talking. Okay. Next part 5, the meat of the story. What storytellers often forget is that audiences and readers don't actually care what your story is about. They don't care how complicated or intricate the plot is, and the twists and turns of the plot are not what is going to make your story unforgettable. They may be excited by the depth of your lore and the details of the characters and their history, but what occurs in the present story is only as interesting as how you tell it. If you create an epic, world-trotting saga about a hero who needs to achieve a particular goal to save the world, doesn't that plot already sound so familiar? Of course it does. That story has been told 1 million times, but what makes us keep coming back to it is how it's told. So whether it's Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, or The Dark Tower, all of these stories have a very similar story frame, but in the details and how they're told is completely different. Essentially, they are about a meek good overcoming epic evil. But Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and The Dark Tower are immensely different stories. Here's an example. Inception is a beloved movie by filmmakers and writers, but the story itself is actually not that complicated. A group of people are hired to influence a person's decision through dreams. Each dream level is slower than the prior level the further you go. And that's it. The rest of how that story is told is what makes it fun. the beautiful characters, the engaging scenarios for them to be in, the conflict, the goals, the expectations, and the missed expectations. That's what elevates a good idea for a story to an engaging story for audiences that they want to come back to. You can flesh out an entire universe of detail and create a lengthy backstory and excruciating attention to minutia, but all of it is worthless if your reader, if you don't tell those things well. If you ignore pacing, rhythm, and flow, and instead bombard your audience with exposition and plot-driven dialogue and events, it suddenly becomes a chore to watch, to read, or to listen to. Theater can sometimes be easier for a writer to convey their message because the actor does a lot of the how legwork for you. It's their job to make the character study the audience is experiencing in real time engaging in how they perform your dialogue and your story. Theater is a kind of hyper focus on the how and not so much the what. So plays like Waiting for Godot, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, No Exit, Bug, these are all simple stories in single locations, but how they are told is textured, complicated, beautiful, ugly, and ultimately engaging. So when you're mapping out your story, it is important to be flexible. The characters you create may surprise you and do things that you didn't plan on actually writing. If you are rigid in the story and what you want to see your characters and forcing your characters to make decisions and not allowing them to oppose your plot map, you will be in conflict as a writer and you will hit writer's block. For example, Stephen King was convinced that Annie was going to murder Paul in his book Misery, and no one was more surprised than King himself that Paul survived. Stephen King allowed the story to flow naturally, and without controlling it too much, that flexibility allowed for an unexpected story that kept all of us engaged. So instead of creating a plot map that says something like, Jane travels home via train. She reunites with her mom over coffee. They get into a fight over cherry pie. Jane throws the pie into her mom's face and runs out. They never speak again. So instead of that plot, it could instead be Jane is apprehensive to travel home to see her mother. It doesn't go the way that either of them expect it to. Drama unfolds, and both of them are left feeling guilty and empty. That plot allows for a path that is more emotional rather than event-based and structured. There's a flexibility in how, when, and why those things happen. And this creates an opportunity for the story to flow out of us in its own way and for the characters to make decisions based on their unique personalities. In order to have an engaging story in either music or books or plays, etc., we need to have these believable characters. If you've ever taken a character development class, then you know how important it is to develop a persona. As an actor, you normally only get the dialogue itself to go off of, and this is important, and we'll come back to that in a bit. But sometimes a playwright will give us a brief description of who the character is. A good trick as a writer is to develop a character plot for your story, the way an actor would if they were playing a role. So here's what an actor needs when they're playing a character. They need a show objective. This is what does the character want throughout the entire story, keeping in mind that their show objective can change based on the plot. The next thing your character needs is a scene objective. Every scene a character is in, they want something. And that can change during the scene based on what happens in the story. And finally, a line objective. While you don't need to be meticulous about this, a character does want something in everything that they say. We also need to have history, which we will also go into more detail in the next part. But previous circumstances are essential when creating fleshed out textured characters. Where did this character come from? What kind of life did they have up until the point that the story starts? And what kind of defining traumas or experiences occurred? Give your character quirks. Define whether the character has a weird laugh or a tic or habits, etc. So that is the end of part 5, the meat of the story. Okay, any questions?
Yeah, it looks like we do from Serena. She asked, how do you know how much exposition to have in a play?
That is a great question. I think one of the biggest mistakes we made when we do our first draft is we say too much. We tend to give away too much. We unload things, and it often happens far too much in dialogue. So as far as knowing exactly how much, that's really going to come up to each writer. That's really going to come up to them to kind of determine, is there too much in here? Is there not enough? I think specifically in plays, If you find that your characters are constantly asking questions of one another, that might be too much exposition. If your characters aren't just existing in the moment and engaging with one another in a way that is not furthering the plot, you might be safe. But if everything hinges on plot, if everything hinges on giving our audience more information and not enough just existing in the present moment, that might be too much exposition.
Melissa mentioned that her favorite plays have the least amount of exposition.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also a style, right? Sometimes we love plays that are like these really fun, complicated, story-driven, plot-driven experiences. But sometimes we also love plays that are more mysterious. And people get to leave the theater going, here's what I think this play was about. But someone sitting next to you has a completely different feeling about what that play was about. And so that's the power of you being the writers. You get to kind of choose what your audience is going to think, but also recognize that once you put something out there into the world, it becomes your audience's. They now get to decide what it's about, and you can only fight them so much on that. Cough, cough, Stephen King, The Shining. Okay, awesome. All right, so we're almost done, actually, because this next part's a little bit long, but the other parts are much shorter, so we're nearing completion. So part 6. Creating a map to the castle. Remember, we talked about how intimidating it would be to sit down in front of that blank white screen and attempt to put down the first word of thousands. Or perhaps you're even a quarter of the way through your story and you've come up to the climax and you're both afraid and unsure of how to get all the pieces now in the right place. The next step is not clear to you, and now that fear starts to set in. You start to say those things to yourself that we talked about earlier. That you're not good enough, that you are not meant to be a storyteller, that there are better people out there than you. Everything that you've created is crap. Okay, let's stop beating yourself up and calmly remind ourselves that this happens to everyone. Every artist you have ever loved has had a day where mid-masterpiece they've broken down in self-doubt and frustration. And when this happens to you, it is not a sign that you shouldn't be doing this. It's not a cosmic message from ethereal creatures telling you, yeah, no, we had other plans for you, actually. All it is, in its entirety, is a manifestation of how much this means to you, of how much you care about this story, and how you are trying to tell, and why you actually are a storyteller. This is why you are a creative person, and that is why you can pat yourself on the back and not give up this creative life. Okay, so now you're thinking, oh, that's great, and that's emotional, and thank you for the pep talk, but really, I can't seem to finish the damn story, so what the hell do I do? Okay, here's what I think you should do. Stop making things so difficult for yourself. And just so you know, I say that to myself about 10 times a day. Do you remember the square inch frame? You need to hone your thoughts and narrow your narrative and stop trying to take a big bite out of a 1,000-page epic. You can't build a pyramid from the top, so the best we can do is to get there is to focus on each stone. So this can help when you're either first starting out or when you've hit a wall. Narrow your focus. Focus on just 1 square inch of the story for right now. Okay, so now you're thinking, okay, that's great, but really that's not enough, and I'm not satisfied with the square inch thing, and I don't know how to continue my story. Okay, if that's the case, you can't be afraid to compartmentalize your story or the development of it. Use a formula to give yourself automatic direction. And one of those formulas is A, B, D, C, E, which roughly translates to a formula to help you navigate your great idea for a story. So first is A, action, something to kickstart the story with excitement and activity and bring in the audience. Then B, background. Who are these people? What are their previous circumstances and what is their history? D, development. Something new happens to them that challenges them to force them to either grow or not to grow. And then C, climax. All of these elements come to a head. And then finally E, ending. We wrap up our story and hopefully our character has changed in some way. The A, B, D, C, E formula can be a nice way to simply map out the events and to give you some kind of direction when you're telling a story. You may not always need this to help you, but why make things harder for yourself if they don't have to be? I've even broken the acts of a play I've written into themes as opposed to anything at all to do with story. as a framing device when I was feeling overwhelmed by the concept of my story. I was too afraid to even start writing, but then I reminded myself that I'm allowed to have a bad first draft, and I can create small beacons of light in the fog of my story to help guide my writing. So for my 3-act play, I created the following. Act 1, desire for newness and hope. Act 2, painful apprehension of opportunity. Act 3, devastated by the disappointing reality. And once the story gets rolling and your character's desires and objectives begin to make themselves clear, you will begin to feel what will happen next. The real mapping of your story always becomes more detailed after the bulk of your narrative has been created. In the latter days of writing your story, you refine the story plot to its most important themes, and this can actually help you edit. Another way to give yourself clearer trajectory in writing your story, especially if you're doing a kind of mystery or a story which depends on the previous circumstances of the characters, it's perfectly fine to create a timeline of historic events of your characters to use as you move the story forward. For example, your story may be about people seeing each other again for the first time in 30 years. So select a day or a month or a year 30 years ago. And underneath it, write the name of every single character and where and what they were doing on that date. Not only can this give you as a writer some structure and a feeling of history with your characters, it can often help you avoid plot holes. And I mean actual plot holes, not just things that happen in stories that audiences don't like, so they call them plot holes. Like Luke Skywalker nearly killing his nephew. Yeah, you may not like that he would do that, but it's not a freaking plot hole. Okay? Sorry. Anyway. That is the end of part 7, creating a map to the castle. Do we have any questions? Or does anyone want to argue with me about Luke Skywalker, because I will fight you? Okay, cool. It looks like we're good. And we still somehow have the same amount of participants from when we started till now. How cool is that? Okay.
Oh, did you plan the Luke Skywalker thing?
No comment, though I am a really good actor. Okay. Part 7, kill your darlings. Do you remember the first draft that we talked about? Or as Anne Lamott would say, the shitty first draft? We need this draft because this is where we throw everything at a wall and we see what sticks. As mentioned before, the first draft is writing a lot of what will not make it into the final story. First drafts have often been described before as first telling the story to yourself, and then you must remove everything that is not the story in the second draft. That is, of course, easier said than done. And I know editing and cutting out the fat and killing your darlings is essential. It's hard, but it is essential to good storytelling. Knowing when to remove a scene somewhere or move the scene somewhere else. Perhaps a line or a verse or an entire chapter needs to be cut, cutting characters, events, plot points, etc. A lot of this is really going to come down to your gut. But as a solid strategy for gaining clarity on knowing what to cut and what not to cut is actually time away from your project or story. So after you've completed your first draft, you go through it immediately while the flow is still in your body and you make very light edits. Only minor changes. And then you need to let this project, this play, this script, this whatever, you need to let it bake for at least 3 weeks without looking at it. You're going to miss it, and it will be hard not to add a piece of brilliant dialogue that comes to you when you're at the grocery store shopping for artichokes. That is what your notebook is for. And we'll get to that in the next part. But you have to leave it alone. Do not touch it at all. Parts of the story will play through your mind. You'll fantasize about the epic climactic scene again and again and how perfectly it flows. Believe me, this is going to be a really wonderful time for you. This is when you are going to be most proud of that first draft, is when you are away from it for 3 weeks. So now after this at least 3-week break, it's time to revisit it. You'll have fresher eyes on the work. You'll have less of an attachment to things that might have seemed really, really vital 3 weeks ago. And this is going to be hard. That flawless climactic scene with perfect pacing, it's actually really clunky. And lines that you wrote as filler that have appeared fine before are now glaringly disruptive to your story. And you're devastated. How could this have happened? You were so convinced it was perfect. Is this going to happen every time you do cuts? Yes. Yeah. every single time. And it's going to be just as painful. But it's not going to be as bad after the third draft and fourth draft and fifth draft. But this here's the remedy. Start making cuts. If you want to feel better about this first draft, start cutting things. And do not allow yourself to add anything in this round of editing. Only go through and remove. Don't be afraid to make sweeping cuts. Remove scenes or combine characters, shorten scenes, streamline dialogue. Get the story closer to what you've been fantasizing about for the last 3 weeks. After all of that, you should be feeling a little bit better. And it's probably 10 pages shorter. So now it's the time to share the play with a trusted friend. And remember to take their feedback through a filter. If they say something like, I wish I knew more about this character, that might mean that you wrote that character perfectly to leave them wanting more. If they say something like, this scene really made me uncomfortable, that may be a great thing. You know, art, storytelling, writing, it's not always intended to make people feel good. A major part of knowing what should and should go is the rhythm and flow of the story. Read your words out loud, hearing what it sounds like and feels like in your mouth. Sometimes something that appeared clunky on the page is actually that's a great example, I can't talk, is actually really realistic and natural sounding out loud. The play Equus is a really good example of looking odd on the page, but sounding very natural when read out loud. However, some things that seem perfect and beautiful on the page may appear awkward or forced when you say them out loud. Get people together to read your words. Make it a casual, informal experience at your house or a coffee shop, but always remember to filter that feedback. There's an energy that writers attempt to build up moving into the end of a section or before something important happens in a story. Sometimes the lines get shorter and overlap and causes the audience and reader to lean forward with anticipation or fear or excitement. So look for those moments. Wonder if something is derailing that buildup. The flow of your writing is how you guide the audience through all the emotional impacts of your story. So put yourself in their shoes as you review your own words. You should experience a lifting or an excitement the same time as the characters do. Or if they're feeling dread or anxiety, some of that should be impacting you as well. So for a quick moment, let's specifically talk about dialogue, because dialogue is a huge issue for people who are working on books or plays. Some of you, for those of you who are here because of playwriting or screenwriting, this is really the meat of your story. When you're writing a novel or a short story, so much of your time is given to telling of the story, and that there are mostly huge chunks of text broken up with small bouts of dialogue from the book's characters. You could argue that the body of a novel is its own voice and a kind of dialogue directly to the reader. In fact, many authors employ this concept to make the writing flow a little bit more naturally. Books like To Kill a Mockingbird, Catcher in the Rye, Perks of Being a Wallflower, etc. But with a play or a screenplay, the majority of your writing is actually dialogue. So how do we make it not suck? So here are just general blanket tips. We're not going to go too much into detail about it, but I did touch on it a little bit earlier. Avoid questions. This is a surefire sign of weak writing and forcing your plot. Keep expository dialogue to a minimum. Show us the story, don't tell us the story. Not every character needs to be witty. Not every line has to be a joke. This happens a lot in your early writing. You want everyone to be funny because it's a way of you showing off your own wit by making everyone else just kind of sarcastic and brilliant. Try not to use similar lines. Characters should not be repeating themselves unless it's for a specific reason. And get to the point. Don't assume your audience is stupid and needs things drilled again and again and again for clarity, and using dialogue as a way of doing that. So go with your instincts when it comes to cutting down content or killing your darlings, but be sure to factor in some time to let the story settle in your brain, but also to settle in your heart. That is the end of part 7, Killing Your Darlings. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, looks like Jade said, regarding cuts, would you suggest making notes on what to add? I took a long break, over a year, and there's a huge revamp desired.
I think the biggest time when you want to actually add something to your story is if someone you've shared it with doesn't understand the ending. And not like a cool, fun, like Stanley Kubrick not understanding the ending way. If they literally don't understand how you got to this point, that is a surefire sign that something needs to be added to your story. All right?
What should I believe of in the mindset of the audience if it's a physics heightened musical?
That's a very specific question. I'm not sure. Maybe psychic heightened musical is what they meant. I don't know.
It's possible.
Okay.
Like,
That's a great question. I think when we're creating things that have a very specific style or tone and we're affecting a style, it makes it harder to know what to edit. It does make it harder to know what to cut because, musicals obviously tend to be much more expository when it comes to the dialogue. And certainly a lot of the exposition comes in the songs. The songs are so much of the story, and sometimes saying exactly what the characters are feeling. So there's a little bit of heightened reality that you get to do when you're working on something like a musical or a panto. But the same thing applies if you're working on a farce, if it's a straight play. But Les Miserables is such a good example of characters literally singing exactly what they are feeling, or literally singing what characters are doing on stage. So I approach every project that I'm working on in terms of how I edit, how I write, and how aggressive I am with cuts based on the style of project that it is. It's the same thing you would do if I was directing a, tragic Shakespeare play, or if I was directing, Boeing, how I am as a director, how I behave, how meticulous I am, it's going to be different. So I love that question. I think you need to hone all of those things I talked about depending on the specific project that it is. I hope that kind of answered that question. If it didn't, it's because I'm not really sure how to answer a physic heightened musical, but I cannot wait to see that. Whatever that is, that sounds awesome. Okay, I am going to move on. We're 2 parts away from being done, so this is great. Part 8, note cards, journals, and the little monster. So imagine this. You're in line at your favorite coffee shop. You've got headphones in and you're listening to music that makes you feel calm. The line is moving slow, but you don't mind. You've got plenty of time today to do whatever you want. The woman at the front of the line gets her coffee and pastry and walks past you to leave. And as she does so, you get a whiff of her perfume mixed with her sugary coffee drink. And suddenly you are transported to your aunt's kitchen when you were 8 years old. She's making you breakfast and telling you stories about when she was a kid. You love the smell of her creamy, sweet coffee drink in the vibrant, oversized mug, and you hang off of every word that she's saying. This whole thing just hits you. There's so much vibrancy and detail and words associated with this memory. Comfort, peace, sweets, family, safety, and more. You start to see a story emerge from this memory, perhaps a song or a painting about this vivid experience that you had. You tell yourself when you get home, you're going to start writing down all of these things that you associate with the memory and the vibrancy of it all, and then you're going to create something special. But you know what? That music you're listening to jumps your mind to another track. You buy your coffee and then the barista asks about your day and you end up dropping the coffee, which is super embarrassing. You spend the next 10 minutes wiping it up off the floor because you insist it was your fault. So you get home, you sit down to work on that story, and guess what? It is less vibrant than when you think about it. When you think about your aunt's mug, it's now just a memory. It doesn't have the same feeling, and those smells are gone. The details are missing. Whatever spark there was, that little bit of magic that ignited the inspiration, it has somehow faded. So that's a pretty terrible scenario. And we could have avoided that disaster with a small notebook, index card, Post-it notes, even the notes section of your phone. The notes section of my phone, if ever discovered after my death, would confound anyone who read it. But for me, it's a chest of little bits of magic, phrases, names, locations. Some of them are disjointed assemblages of words, but sometimes they are entire descriptions of future stories. We never know when these moments of inspiration are going to strike, and it is best to be prepared. Always carry a little notebook with you in case something jumps out at you. Believe me, and this will become a sacred practice after not too long. These bits of magic and potential story gems are what we use to feed this little monster that is inside of us, that helps us and lets us write. And that is what I call it. I call it a little monster, but some people call it their radical voice or the animal inside. But whatever you call it, you need to acknowledge that there is a part of you, this part of you, whatever this voice is, that does not care about your morals or social pressures or rules of writing or grammar or even the truth. But this voice inside you wants to write, and you have to let it. So that is how we tap into the reckless writing that we talked about earlier. Your little monster doesn't care if you write something that would make your mother blush, and frankly, neither should you. Your little monster doesn't care if you aren't using the correct words when describing the gardening your character is doing. The editor will fix that later in draft 2 or 3. Draft 1 is for the little monster and the reckless writing. I read this wrong. Draft 1 is for the little monster and the reckless writing, and do not get in its way. If you do, he will not give you access to the treasure chest of writing gems. Your journals, your note cards, those little bits of magic and the little monster inside you, they all work together to unearth your stories. And it's work to keep that ecosystem functioning, but it is rewarding, I promise you. It's worth it. So that's the end of part 8, note cards, journals, and the little monster. Any questions? Perfect. I'm going to edit out that part where I flubbed over my my dialogue because I need to appear perfect to people who watch this later. Okay, this is the last part. This is the final part, part 9, stuck before the finish line. So we can only finish our stories by pushing through to the end, regardless of how we feel or how long it has taken us. Keeping in mind that the first draft is designed to be edited, it takes off some of the pressure that it needs to be good. So remember to give yourself permission to write crap and to fill journals with bad writing and bad ideas, because among all of those things will be some gems. Most writers never even start their story at all. So if you have anything down on paper, you are already more ahead than most people. And don't forget that one of the biggest mistakes that writers can make at first is biting off more than they can chew. So start off with those small milestones to achieve. We talked about the square inch frame of writing about your memories, but another way to refocus your story, to work through your ideas, is to tell yourself to write this story, this idea that you have, challenge yourself to write the entire thing on a single piece of paper. It has to be the full beginning, middle, and the end. And even if you follow the A, B, D, C, E formula, it must fill an entire page. Once you've done that, you now need to take that same exact story and you need to now stretch it to 2 pages. Then to 3. I don't know why that wasn't obvious and I lost my plus on the page. And then to 3 pages. All right, so if you can take the same thing and you can fill an entire page, beginning, middle, and end, then you challenge yourself to do it again, but with 2 pages, and then you challenge yourself to do it again with 3. This is a wonderful practice. This is also going to get those milestones under your belt, because once you get into the rhythm of starting and finishing a single story, the length moving forward will be irrelevant. We have to get that beginning and ending into our systems. The milestones of completion will get us into a habit of always completing our projects. But how do we deal with things like writer's block? There is no cure for writer's block, no surefire cure for writer's block. If that is the sole reason that you join this workshop, I am sad to tell you I have no magic answer. I do, however, have small tips for writer's block, because here is what I do, what I have heard to do, and things that have helped me. So you don't know what to do, you don't know what to write, you don't even know what to create next, and you're stuck. Write what shouldn't happen next. Because remember, your first shitty draft is all about writing what your story is not going to ultimately be about. So write what definitely should not happen next. Because through exploring what shouldn't happen, it might unveil what probably should. Simplify what is there. Often we lose momentum or direction because we've spread the pieces of our story far too wide. So try combining characters, try combining scenes, try combining themes and seeing what happens. Review your characters' objectives. Is something in the way of them getting what they want? If there's not something getting in the way of what they want, then it's kind of hard to write a story. So maybe you need to create some obstacles. Or if there are too many, maybe you need to start pulling back and remove some of those obstacles for your characters so they can achieve their show goal or story goal. When you have conquered how you're telling the story and you've avoided what you're telling the story about, when you've conquered how you're telling the story and you've avoided what you're telling the story about, perhaps it's time to explore why you are telling it. So going back to that initial spark of inspiration, go back to those words that we talked about that you write down in your story Bible, those things that brought those ideas to you. If you really are struggling with writer's block and those things didn't help, go read something. Turn your brain off. Grab Harry Potter, Stephen King, Gilbert, Tolkien, Shakespeare, anything. But go go take in other stories, go absorb, and just allow yourself to have a bit of a break. Maybe you're taking that 3-week break from your project before it's done. That's okay. And then this one of my favorite ones, just dress up, take a shower, put on some makeup, style your hair, put on a gown. I sometimes will put on a flowing red dress so I can get back into it. Sometimes you just need to feel better, or change your location, go to a coffee shop, go sit out on your patio, just shake something up. Maybe you're getting stagnant because of the scenario you're in. Try refocusing on the square inch of your story. Role play as one of your characters, and as if they're writing a letter to another one of your characters. Sometimes that can help reveal what needs to happen next. Finally, be nice to yourself and take an actual break. Go for a walk, go for a vacation, or visit other projects, and that block may dissolve on its own over time. But the biggest advice that I can give everyone as far as writing in general and storytelling in general, and not just writer's block, is just to start doing it and make that writing a daily habit. So writing is a personal experience, and how you go about doing it is really up to you. You don't need to compare your process to other people. You don't need to worry if they're judging you. You just need to do it. You need to write every single day, and try not to throw any of that writing away, because it's basically a roadmap of your development. And there could be some gems hidden in that mess. Enjoy the writing process. That's the ultimate thing, because that's the cornerstone of why you're even doing this in the first place. Remind yourself of why you're creative. Why are you doing this? Why nothing can stop you from creating magic right now. There is no until, there is no fear, and you can control the size and type of content you create so that you can avoid ever becoming overwhelmed. You're the master of whatever universe you choose to create, and there's nothing better than sharing that world with other people and how they make their creations their own. So that's the end of the storytelling lecture. So this time we can open it up to a Q&A if you want. And I just want to thank everyone for spending this time with me and hearing what I have to say, and hearing what I have to say about storytelling. It's been a lot of fun for me. I love talking about this.
It looks like we had a question come in that says, can you repeat the second tip of writer's block again?
Second tip of writer's block is simplify what is there. Often we lose momentum or direction because we've spread the pieces of our story out too far. Try attempting combining characters, or try combining scenes. You're welcome. Ooh, you're welcome again. In your opinion, do you think the greatest stories involve characters whose wants and desires stay focused throughout, or the ones whose characters' desires change a lot more? That's a great question that Allison has.
Probably reread that, because it was only sent to you.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Me?
Yes, I think that question was only sent to you specifically.
Okay, this maybe because they don't want some people to know, so I'll keep it private. But in your opinion, do you think the greatest stories involve characters whose wants and desires stay focused throughout, or ones whose characters' desires change a lot in response to the plot events? That's a great question. So like I mentioned, in show objectives, scene objectives, and line objectives, those can change because of the story. And there's a great bit of advice that Pixar has that some of you may already be aware of, and something you may have noticed when you watch Pixar movies. But a lot of the time, the characters, what they want at the beginning of a Pixar story, they don't get at the end, but what they do get ends up being better than what they thought they did. So I love that you brought that up, because I think that's what makes stories so engaging. You think a character wants fame and money and whatever at the beginning of the story, but through the story you tell, maybe it turns out what they really wanted was connection and validation from people around them. So I think it's wonderful and exciting when characters change and when their desires change because of the story.
A couple questions are being asked about if the video is going to be released and if you're going to be releasing it online.
I think the video will be released, even though I messed up a few times. But to be honest, I was getting kind of tired toward the end of this. But yeah, I will be releasing the video. We've been recording it this whole time, so that'll make it to Sac Blue, the Facebook page. So if you just type that in and follow us, that's where you will find this video. As far as a written outline of the lecture, there will not be one that is everything I said, but there will be an outline, which is what you asked. So I guess I could have said yes. Yes, there will be just a basic breakdown of everything that I hit. And just as a general statement for everyone, I am constantly growing and evolving and changing. So what you witnessed today is where I'm at currently as a writer, and my views and my opinions and how I engage with my writing. Things will change. I hope they change. I hope I continue to evolve. So if you do a workshop with me again in a year and I say something contradictory to what I said today, that's called growth, okay? And and also, Amanda and I are planning on releasing more focused workshops on each of these parts. So that if you want to dive deeper into plot development and actually have specific questions and really get into writing, this was more of a broad workshop to cover everything all at once. It's part of why it was free. And then potentially moving forward, because all this Zoom stuff and all this recording stuff, it's not free for us. So we may, create small monetary fees, but to dive in deeper into some of these topics so we can have more of an exchange. And hopefully when all of this stuff is over, all this craziness that's happening in the world, we can be in person again and actually share writing with one another and have those engagements. I really look forward to that. Can you send a link over to the email? Yeah, maybe some of you aren't on Facebook, which is totally understandable. I keep finding out more and more how old I am because people like under the age of 25 hate Facebook. So yeah, I will. I'll send it out. How about I send it out to everyone who's registered to this class, which I know is not everyone who's participating now. So the other thing I'll do is it'll be on my Instagram, and I will also put it on my website, which is davidbluegarrison.com. So we'll link it there as well.
Don't see any other questions.
All right. Yeah, and if you have questions, if a question comes to you later and you want to connect, you can go to my website. There is a contact page. That's davidbluegarrison.com. You can send me a question, and I'll do my best to get back to you and engage with you. I'm almost more excited about reading and analyzing other people's work than talking about my own. So I do look forward to an experience like that. So just let me know.
All right, guys.
All right, thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Have a wonderful life.